they could not fathom that a woman was the primary architect of the discovery.
The Unrecorded Interview. History documentary series.
Madame Curie, welcome to the Unrecorded Interview. It's an honor.
Turn that machine, please. The sound is grating, and I have little patience for dramatic entrances.
I apologize, but it's necessary context for our modern viewers. Most people don't realize that over a century later, your laboratory notebooks, even your cookbooks, are still so lethally radioactive they must be stored in lead-lined boxes. Your own body is buried in the Panthéon in a lead coffin.
It seems fitting. I left a scientific legacy that is literally untouchable. We did not fully appreciate the danger of the materials we handled, but I do not regret the work. The physical toll was simply the price of unlocking the atom.
Let's talk about the price you paid long before you isolated radium. You were born in Warsaw under a repressive czarist regime that actively tried to stamp out Polish culture.
They made it illegal to speak our native tongue or teach our history in schools. My father, a physics professor, was cheated out of what might have been an outstanding career because he was Polish. The grief of oppression was heavy, compounded by the deaths of my mother and sister when I was just a child. I learned early to hold my head high and walk through the icy atmosphere of criticism.
Biographer Susan Quinn writes at length about your involvement in the Flying University, a clandestine operation for women in Poland.
It was a necessity. The Russian government prohibited women from attending university anywhere in its empire. But Polish positivists started a secret academy, moving locations to avoid the police. I studied alongside 1,000 other women, reading chemistry and physics in secret. We believed you could not hope to build a better world without improving the individuals.
The drive eventually led you to Paris in 1891 to the Sorbonne. Barbara Goldsmith notes in her biography that you were one of only 23 women among nearly 2,000 science students.
I lived in a freezing garret on the 6th floor, hauling coal up the stairs. Sometimes I survived on radishes and tea, and once fainted in the library from sheer malnutrition. But I was exhilaratingly free. It was a new world of science that I was at last permitted to know in all liberty.
And in that world you met Pierre Curie. History often portrays you as his faithful assistant, a romantic myth where you merely helped the great man.
That is a patronizing fiction. When I began studying the rays emitted by uranium, the question was entirely new. I, alone, discovered that the radiation was an atomic property and that pitchblende, a heavy black ore, was far more radioactive than uranium itself. It was I who proposed the term radioactivity.
Pierre recognized the magnitude of what you were doing.
Yes. He abandoned his own research on crystals to join me in my search for the unknown substance. We were collaborators, but the initial hypothesis, the method of identifying elements by measuring their radioactivity, was mine.
Yet, the scientific establishment actively tried to erase you. In 1903, 4 influential French academics wrote a letter nominating only Pierre and Henri Becquerel for the Nobel Prize in Physics.
They were men blinded by tradition and systemic prejudice. One of them, Gabriel Lippmann, had been my own professor. They could not fathom that a woman was the primary architect of the discovery. Pierre, thankfully, possessed a rare integrity. He refused to accept the prize unless my name was included.
And so you became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. But the public preferred a fairy tale. They pictured you in a miserable shed, stirring pots by magic.
There was no magic, it was brutal. Factory-level labor. We worked in an abandoned dissection shed with a leaky glass roof. Sometimes I had to spend a whole day mixing a boiling mass with a heavy iron rod nearly as large as myself. I was broken with fatigue. We treated tons of pitch-blende residue just to extract a few grains of pure radium.
Then, in 1906, Pierre was struck by a horse-drawn wagon and killed instantly. You presented a completely impassive face to the world. But your private mourning diary tells a different story.
I wrote to him in the silence of my laboratory, telling him I walked like a hypnotized woman. I lost my companion and my partner. But I resolved to continue his work.
You took his chair at the Sorbonne, becoming their first female professor. But that triumph was soon overshadowed. Which brings us to the darkest chapter of your public life, the 1911 scandal.
I fail to see what my private life has to do with my scientific record.
Our viewers need to understand the hypocrisy you faced. You found comfort in Paul Langevin, a brilliant physicist and former student of Pierre's. Lauren Redness documents how his estranged wife stole your intimate letters from his desk.
It was an odious, organized blackmail. Paul's marriage was a disaster long before we grew close. But the right-wing press did not care about the truth or my humanity.
No, they didn't. They labeled you a foreign demon, a homewrecker, and exploited anti-Semitism by baselessly calling you a Jew. They surrounded your house and threw stones at your windows while your daughters were inside.
I was treated like a hunted beast. The men of the press were vultures feeding on carrion. Because I was a woman with a career and a mind of my own, my independence terrified them. They used my gender and my Polish origins to incite a xenophobic rage.
At the absolute height of this media crucifixion, you received a telegram. You had won a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for isolating pure radium. But the Nobel Committee lost its nerve.
Yes, a cowardly member of the committee wrote to me, suggesting I should not come to Sweden to accept it because of the Langevin affair. They feared a scandal at their banquet.
Your reply is legendary.
I told them that the prize was awarded for the discovery of radium and polonium. I believe that there is no connection between my scientific work and the facts of private life. I refuse to let slander dictate my professional dignity. I went to Stockholm.
You had allies, though. Albert Einstein was furious on your behalf. He wrote you a letter telling you to hold the riffraff in contempt.
Albert was a true friend. He told me that if the rabble continued to be occupied with me, I should simply stop reading their drivel. He said, leave it to the vipers it was fabricated for.
Speaking of Professor Einstein, for those who want to hear his own confession, we have his interview on our channel. Make sure to watch it after this episode. Madame Curie, returning to your work. Despite everything, your body was failing. You suffered from tinnitus, cataracts, and aplastic anemia. Yet you lived in denial about the radiation.
Radium was my child. When you spend your life giving birth to a discovery, extracting it from the earth with your own blistered hands, it is difficult to accept that it is killing you. We kept vials of it by our bed just to watch its beautiful, fairy-like glow in the dark.
Barbara Goldsmith calls it an obsessive genius. Was the ultimate sacrifice worth it?
Progress is neither swift nor easy. But look at what we achieved. We proved that the atom was not indivisible. We opened the door to modern physics, to treatments for tumors, and to the mobile X-rays, which I personally brought to the battlefields of the Great War.
But it also opened the door to weapons of mass destruction. Pierre warned in his Nobel speech that radium in criminal hands could be a terrible tool.
Pierre was right to ask if humanity was sufficiently mature to profit from nature's secrets. Science is neutral. It is human nature that is volatile.
As a final reflection, what does radium represent to you now looking back at the 21st century?
Radium is a mirror of humanity. It contains immense, brilliant energy, capable of destroying diseased cells and illuminating the darkness. But if you handle it recklessly, if you are not emotionally and morally ready for its power, it will burn you to the bone.
We must approach progress not with fear, but with the rigor required to understand it.
The Unrecorded Interview. History documentary series.